Okay, hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us for our webinar. We're going to be talking about Social Security overpayments and supplemental security income. We are staff from Disability Rights New Jersey. I'll tell you a little bit about us in just 1 second. I will be your master of ceremonies for the day, which basically means I just get to watch all the boxes as we go through. And as you listen to our other speakers, I'm excited to be here and I'm happy to support my colleagues. My name is Mike Murata. I am the director of our Richard West Assistive Technology Advocacy Center at Disability Rights New Jersey. And there's all my contact info on the screen. I think I would have felt weird if I didn't put my contact info. I'm not sure if you need it, but there it is. You have it in case you do. Happy to reach out and chat with you about anything related to assistive technology. As we go through today, quick housekeeping before we start, before we dive into the content. We do want to hear from you. So please feel free. The chat is open and you can put information in there. Our speakers will be monitoring the chat as we go, as will I. So please feel free, put comments or questions in there. I know we'll save some time for questions at the end, but perhaps we'll see something as we're moving that maybe we can answer right away and resolve that issue for you as we go. So just keep putting your information in there. Other quick housekeeping things. We're going to check for questions at the end. I had a note and I'm sorry, I lost my place on my note here. We are recording the session. The recording will come to you afterwards, maybe later today or tomorrow morning. You'll get a link for the recording so you can review it. There's also closed captions. If you need that, look along the bottom of your screen and there should be an option for the live captions there. If you don't see it, just put a message to me in the chat privately and I'll help you figure out where that is on your screen as we go through. But again, ask your questions. An event like this is meant to give you an opportunity to get your questions answered. So please feel free to participate with us as we move through. So who are we? We're Disability Rights New Jersey. We are a private nonprofit. We provide legal and advocacy services to individuals with disabilities throughout New Jersey. We are the designated agency for protection and advocacy. And we were incorporated in 1994. And our mission is to preserve the human, civil, and legal rights of people with disabilities. A little bit about us. And we'll have some contact information for our agency at the end. We'll share the contact information so you have it. And with that, I'll turn it over and let our presenters introduce themselves.
Good afternoon. My name is Kathleen Redpath Perez, and I'm the managing attorney for the employment unit.
My name is Charles Auslander. I'm a staff attorney here at Disability Rights New Jersey, and I want to thank everyone for joining us this afternoon.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Susan Head, and I am a senior staff advocate on the employment team.
All right, I'm going to get us started. So you just heard from our MC extraordinaire, Mike Murata, and so I have a very tough act to follow, but I'm going to try my best. And first, we're going to make a commitment to you today that you are going to learn at least 3 things in this webinar, and we're going to go through what those are. The first thing that I promise that we are going to teach you today is what is a Social Security overpayment. You're also going to learn what you should do if you receive an overpayment letter. And lastly, how to avoid an overpayment. Now, I want to pause for a second because if you're here, you might be somebody who is on Social Security and you're facing an overpayment, or you might be worried about having this kind of problem in the future. You might be the support person for someone in either one of these scenarios. And I want you to just take a deep breath. I know that this is a scary situation, but that's why we're here. And there is usually a way to handle an overpayment. Next slide, please. All right, so starting with the first thing that I've promised that we're going to teach you today, what is an overpayment? An overpayment is when Social Security believes that a person has received more benefits than they should have received. An overpayment is considered a debt to the federal government, which Social Security is going to seek to recover. Next slide, please. Now, if you are here because you are facing an overpayment, then you know that usually the way that you're going to know that you have an overpayment is by receiving a letter. In general, it's really, really important to hold on to any letters that you receive from Social Security. If you're having trouble reading the letter or need help explaining what's in the letter, you could always share it with somebody that you trust and they could help you. But any letter from Social Security is something that you have to hold on to. I also want you to pay attention, though, to the amount in your check every month, because let's say there's a scenario where the mail gets lost or something else happens. If you make sure that the amount in your check is the same every month, that's another way to make sure that you're not having an overpayment issue. If you see that there's a month that you're receiving less, I want you to call Social Security and find out what the reason is. It's always best to try to deal with this issue sooner rather than later. It's also important to pay attention to your mail during this time, because at the same time that you receive an overpayment letter, you might also be receiving a letter terminating your benefits from Social Security. Again, I recognize this is a scary situation, but we are here today to teach you how to tackle this issue. Next slide, please. All right, so this is a sample Social Security letter. And I wanted to show all of you this because there's certain information that I want you to be aware of that is going to be in this letter. So the first, and I'm going to ask Mike if he could please point to where the date is. That's in the upper right-hand side of the page. And it's really important to make sure that you highlight that date, that you're aware of that date. And we're going to talk about later why it's important to pay attention to this date. This letter is also, and I'm going to have Mike point to the first paragraph, it's going to have a lot of important information in the first paragraph. So first of all, it's going to have the amount of the overpayment. So if you look at this letter, and this is just a sample letter, this is not to any real person, but in this letter, it says, we are writing to let you know that we've paid you X amount too much supplemental security income money. It's also going to tell you when the overpayment happened. The next sentence says the overpayment happened in month or year, and it will tell you the specific month and year that it happened. The last sentence, and we're going to talk about the reasons why you might face an overpayment later, gives you the reasons that you're facing the overpayment. And in this particular case, this person was overpaid because of their spouse's pension. Now, we're going to talk about what you should do next. And I'm not going to ask Mike to stay on this slide for now. So the next thing that you should do is figure out what type of benefit you receive. Now, this webinar is part of a two-part webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking about SSI, but at a later date, we are going to be talking about SSDI. And it's important to know what benefit you receive because there are you have to handle the two in a completely different way. One easy way to figure out what kind of benefit you receive is by looking at the top of the notice. And so I'm going to have Mike point to the second sentence right at the top of the notice, which says Supplemental Security Income. What that means is that this letter is being addressed to someone who is on SSI. An SSDI notice is going to say old age survivor and disability insurance at the top of the notice. Another way to think about it is to think about what is it about you that makes you eligible or able to receive Social Security. Since we're only talking about SSI today, I'm going to limit my explanation to only SSI. Next slide, please. For SSI, this is a person who is at least 65, blind, or disabled with very low income and resources. For SSDI, which like I said, is going to be discussed in a different webinar, there is different eligibility criteria. Next slide, please. Next, as I said earlier, I want to talk about the reasons why you could face an overpayment. And there's a few that I'm going to discuss here. One reason could be a work-related overpayment. That could happen if you're earning too much money or there's a failure to report. We're going to talk about that more in detail because if you're reporting your income, then Social Security, they can reduce the amount that you're receiving. Another type of overpayment that you could be receiving is a resource-related overpayment. And that's if you've received a student loan or an inheritance. In-kind support overpayment is an overpayment that usually happens when you're living with friends or family and you're not paying for rent or food. The last reason that I have listed here that you could be facing an overpayment is if there's a change in the makeup of your household. An example of that is if you get married. Next slide, please. Lastly, for my part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about just brief information about some of the things that you can do about an overpayment. That's going to be covered in more detail later on. But one of the things that you can do is you can ask for a reconsideration. This is something that you might do if you think that Social Security is wrong and you don't owe an overpayment. You can also ask for a waiver. A waiver is something that you're going to want to ask for if you're saying you're not at fault for causing the overpayment, you can't afford to pay it back, and you feel that it's unfair that you should have to pay this money back. You could also work out a repayment plan, and specific information about that is going to be covered later on, or you could do nothing. All right, well, that is it for me, and I'm going to pass the next part of the presentation on to Charles Auslander.
Thank you so much, Kathleen. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for spending part of your afternoon with us regarding SSI overpayments. I'm going to talk a little bit about the last slide that Kathleen had up there. There were two bullet points. One was about a reconsideration and the other was about a waiver. So we're going to first talk about a reconsideration, and specifically, what is a reconsideration? Well, a request for reconsideration is sometimes called an appeal by Social Security. The purpose of filing for a reconsideration is for you as a beneficiary to challenge the decision that you receive benefits you are not entitled to receive. Your goal is to show that you don't have an overpayment and you don't owe any money to Social Security. Another goal is that even if you do owe money as an overpayment to Social Security, you want to show that Social Security did not properly calculate the amount and you owe less than Social Security claims that you owe. And can we go to the next slide, please? Now, when do you file for a request for reconsideration? Now, remember, we're talking about SSI, Supplemental Security Income, so these are the rules that apply to someone who's receiving SSI. The time to file a request for reconsideration is very important. You want to file a timely request for reconsideration so you don't lose your chance to appeal an overpayment. I'm sorry, it looks like I may have been muted.
Yeah, sorry, Charlie. That was me. I apologize.
Oh, I'm sorry. All right. Well, I'm gonna go back to the beginning of the slide because I just
thanks.
noticed that. Well, we'll start over, ladies and gentlemen. When do you file for reconsideration? As I indicated, we're talking about Supplemental Security Income beneficiaries, and these are the rules about how to file for a reconsideration. This may seem a little repetitive, but it is really important. The time to file a request for reconsideration has to be met because you don't want to lose your chance to file an appeal and challenge the overpayment notice that you receive from Social Security. The time period to file is 60 days. However, if you want to continue receiving your full benefits while your appeal is pending, you must submit your request for reconsideration within 10 days of receiving the overpayment notice. If you fail to file your request for reconsideration within 10 days of receiving the overpayment notice, Social Security will start to withhold up to 10% of your monthly benefits to take back what they claim was an overpayment. So if you want to avoid that while your appeal is pending and you're gathering your documents and preparing to challenge Social Security's decision, you need to file within 60 days, and you need to file within the first 10 days of the 60 days to continue your benefits. Now, if you received a notice of overpayment and you unfortunately missed the 60-day deadline to file a request for reconsideration, don't panic. You can file a written request for an extension of time to file the request within the specified time limit of 60 days. An extension of time to file a late request for reconsideration is made by you to your local Social Security field office, but you have to establish what Social Security calls good cause for missing the deadline. Well, let's talk a little bit about what good cause is. Those may be circumstances that impeded or created a barrier for you to actually pursue your claim or appeal. It could be that the Social Security Administration provided you with misleading or confusing instructions. It could also be that you, as the beneficiary, didn't understand the requirements of the law or the Social Security Act, and that also impeded your ability to timely file an appeal. And it could be that your physical or mental disability prevented you from meeting the 60-day deadline. Also, if you have limited proficiency in English, or you have some educational limitations that prevented you from understanding what you were supposed to do, those would also be good reasons why you failed to meet the 60-day deadline. Essentially, what you have to provide in a written letter is a legitimate reason why you're filing a request for reconsideration after 60 days. And again, it could be something such as a personal illness, you're missing or looking for necessary records to support your case. There may have been a death in the family, or something we often see is that the SSI beneficiary did not receive the overpayment notice in a timely fashion. That's why when Kathleen mentioned the notice earlier, the overpayment notice, you want to double check what the date is on the notice. And also, it's really important to save the envelope that the notice came in. If there's a postmark on it that indicates when it was actually mailed versus when it was actually received, that's important information that might go towards whether you legitimately missed that 60-day period. The bottom line is, for requests for reconsideration, you want to make sure that you file within 60 days, and if you want to continue your benefits, you file within the first 10 days of those 60 days. If you have to file a request for an extension of time, make sure you put it in writing in a letter, and you're going to accompany that letter with your request for reconsideration, which we're going to talk about in a moment. Can we have the next slide, please? What do you have to file for a request for reconsideration? Now, Social Security is a large bureaucracy, and they use a lot of forms. The form that you'll be using for a request for reconsideration is form number SSA 561, and there's a link there on this slide. We're going to talk about that form in a little bit more detail later on, but that's the form that one has to file for a request for reconsideration. Now, once you fill out and complete that form, you're going to send it to your local Social Security field office. Generally, you will mail the form. It's important that if you do mail any correspondence or forms or any documents to your local Social Security office, that you mail it in a way that you can show that it was mailed and it was received by Social Security. We recommend that you mail any notices, documents, or forms to Social Security through the United States Postal Office using return receipt requested. Now, of course, you can use some other mailing methods. You can use some private delivery services, but the important part to take away is that as long as you mail it and you have some way to trace that in fact you mailed it on a given day and it was received by the intended recipient, that being the Social Security Administration, you need to do it. Mailing something, return receipt requested, we find is a good way to prove that Social Security received your documents. So you're going to fill out a form, SSA 561. You may also include a written letter if you're past that 60-day time limit, explaining why you had good reason to file it after 60 days. And then when you go through the form itself, you're going to have an opportunity to request different types of reviews. For Social Security beneficiaries, specifically Supplemental Security Income, you will have an opportunity to ask for a case review of your file or an opportunity to meet with a Social Security representative to discuss your request for reconsideration. A case review is a paper review of your file. You can, of course, submit documents or other information in support of your request for reconsideration, but you won't have a meeting with Social Security representatives. So for a case review, you might mail into them wage earnings, pay stubs, a copy of a lease, bank statements, or other documents that you feel are important to support your case to argue against an overpayment and that you don't owe money to Social Security. Again, it's important that you mail any documents return receipt requested to ensure they actually get to the local field office. Now, you also have an opportunity on this form to request an informal conference. That's different from a case review. An informal conference is where you're requesting an opportunity to meet with a Social Security representative to discuss your request for reconsideration. Now, you can certainly send in an invitation just like a case review. Again, you would send it in a secure way that you can prove you sent it, return receipt requested, and you can send in those bank statements or pay stubs or other documents you feel are necessary to prove your case. Eventually, Social Security will contact you with a time to go to a local field office, meet with a representative, and discuss your case and the documents you sent in support of it. Lastly, when you fill out this form, the SSA 561, you also have the opportunity to ask for a formal conference. That's a hearing that occurs before a hearing officer called an administrative law judge. That individual will listen to testimony that you give. That is, you'll have an opportunity to speak to the administrative law judge. You'll also have an opportunity, just like the first two options, the case review and informal conference, to submit documents or paperwork or anything you think that supports your case. Again, you will have previously mailed that to the office using a secure method. And when you have that formal conference, Social Security will tell you a date and time to come down to a field office, and you'll meet with an administrative law judge, and you or any witnesses that you think are helpful to your case can speak to the judge, provide documents, and explain your case why you don't have an overpayment. And we're going to go to the next slide, please. Now, here's a copy of the form. I'm just going to go through it as an overview, so at least you won't be scared when you actually have to fill out one of these. They're not that complicated. If you look at the upper left-hand side of the form, it says it's an SSA 561. It says it's one of 4 pages. The other pages deal with instructions, and some of it's duplicative, so we're just going to talk about the first page. You see the 3 yellow arrows? They're pointing to different sections of this form that we're going to talk about in just a bit more detail to sort of demystify it and lower your expectations that this is difficult. It is not a difficult process. If you happen to need a family member or a trusted friend to help you out, no problem. I'm sure between the two of you, you can fill it out. We're going to go to the next slide, please. The top part of the form, it shows you that number again, and it's entitled Request for Reconsideration, so you know you have the right form. This is basically contact information, and you, as the SSI beneficiary, would be called the claimant. I know it's a strange word, but that's the person who's filing a claim against Social Security seeking to obtain relief, in this case, that you don't owe money as an overpayment. So you'd put your name as the name of the claimant, you'd put your Social Security down there, and then there's a field for issue being appealed. And under the instructions, they specify different types of disability benefits or SSI benefits. Well, we know from this webinar, if you're listening, you're an SSI beneficiary and you're dealing with an overpayment. And both of those two things appear in those instructions in parentheses. So you want to put what the issue is that's being appealed, the reason you're appealing, which is it's an SSI overpayment. If there's additional information on your notice of overpayment, you might want to include that as well. But you want to specify that it's SSI and not SSD. It's not the other acronym. They have SVB. That has to do with special veterans benefits from World War II. It has nothing to do with you. Your only concern is that you're an SSI claimant or SSI beneficiary, and you're challenging an overpayment that Social Security claims was made. In the second field, it's where you're going to put your reasons why you're challenging or you want Social Security to reconsider. And the instructions read, I do not agree with the Social Security Administration's determination and request reconsideration. That pretty much says it all in a simple sentence. You're going to fill out, with the help of a family member or trusted friend, the reasons why you don't believe you have an overpayment. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky and where you may end up contacting either Disability Rights New Jersey or other resources to either help you fill out the form or discuss what your reason is for challenging the overpayment. It may be that you have earned income that's over the limit that Social Security permits for an SSI beneficiary. It may be, like Kathleen mentioned earlier, that you have too many resources per month. It's called being over-resourced. And a resource is generally something like cash, money, sometimes it's assets like an automobile or a home. But if you have too many resources in a given month, a 30-day period, sometimes that generates an overpayment reason. But in any event, in this field where it says my reasons are, you want to put a brief sentence or two about why you believe you don't have an overpayment, that you didn't earn too much money that made you ineligible for Social Security benefits for 1 month, or you're not over-resourced, that is, you didn't have too much money in any given month. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Now, in the middle part of the form, this explains what I mentioned earlier about the 3 different types of reviews you can ask in support of your request for reconsideration. If you mark the first box, it'll just be a case review, which is a paper review of your file. Of course, you can always submit documents to your local field office in support of your case, but you're not going to have an opportunity to meet with a human being and try to persuade them or explain about the significance of the documents and why you don't owe the overpayment amount. If you check the second box, you're asking for an informal conference. This is a conference where you'll get notice from Social Security. And at that point, you'll get a notice to come in and meet with a representative. And again, you can always bring documents with you, or you could have sent them in previously through the mail. And you can explain the significance of the documents and advocate why Social Security made a mistake. And don't be afraid to say that, because Social Security makes mistakes. It's a large organization, it's a big bureaucracy, and sometimes accidents happen. They may miscalculate figures or even have figures from someone else's account enter into yours. And lastly, if you look, there's a box for the formal conference. That's that hearing that you might have before an administrative law judge. Again, if you request that type of relief, that is a hearing to resolve your problem, you'll appear before an administrative law judge. You can bring witnesses that might help you explain your case. You can also bring documents, as I've always said throughout this webinar. And you can then explain to the judge why you think Social Security is wrong and you don't owe an overpayment, or if you do, they miscalculated that amount. Now we're going to move off from reconsiderations and talk about waivers. Next slide. I jumped the gun there, I apologize. Next slide. Thank you. The very last part of this form, and I'm just mentioning it because you do have to sign off on this form for your request for reconsideration. I know this may seem self-explanatory, but sometimes people forget to do that. So the claimant, that's the SSI beneficiary, you're going to sign the form. If you have a representative, someone who's going to speak on your behalf, and that can be an attorney, it could be a family member or a trusted friend, they can place their name there. And then you're going to put your contact information, which is going to be your mailing address and your phone number. This is important information. It might seem simple, but remember, in the previous slide, you may be requesting to have an informal conference or a formal conference with either a Social Security representative or an administrative law judge. If that's the case, you want to make sure that Social Security can contact you and give you notice when you're going to come in to speak to either a representative or appear before a judge. And now we can go to the next slide and talk about waivers. So we discussed a little bit about the form you have to file in order to do a request for reconsideration of your overpayment, right? That's what Social Security refers to as an appeal. Well, what is a waiver and when do you file one? A waiver is when you're asking Social Security to forgive the overpayment. That means to waive and not make you pay any money back to Social Security. There is no time restriction on when an SSI recipient must file for a waiver. That's very important. Remember, we spent a little time about the fact that there's a 60-day time limit to file a request for reconsideration, and you need to file within 10 days of that first 60 days to avoid having your payments stop. Well, for a waiver, there's no time limitation. However, if you file for a waiver, you have to demonstrate some things or prove to Social Security the following: that you're without fault in causing the overpayment, and you're unable to afford paying back that money without risking the ability to provide for your basic and necessary needs. Those would be living expenses like food or rent or things of that nature. If you can't prove that, you'd have to show that you're without fault in causing the overpayment and that paying back that sum of money would simply be unfair. That means you wouldn't have to prove the second part. So it's 1 and 2 or 1 and 3. In any event, when you file for a waiver, you're basically having to show that you didn't cause the overpayment and it's just not right, or you're unable to pay back that money without causing you to be unable to continue paying your basic bills. Now, another neat thing is that with a waiver, besides being able to file it at any time, is Social Security has what's called an administrative waiver. And that means that if you have an overpayment less than $1,000, it can be waived by the local Social Security field office if you or your representative make a request in writing or even verbally. And there's no indication that there's fault by you that caused the overpayment. This is a pretty lenient standard, and it's really important to think about. So when you get your notice of overpayment and you're reading it and you notice, wow, it's under $1,000, it's still a lot of money, but it's not a huge sum, I might be able to get this waived if I contact Social Security, make a written request, which is preferable, and I can basically show that, in fact, I wasn't responsible for this. They'll forgive or not make you pay that $1,000 overpayment. And we'll go to the next slide, please. Now, how do you file for a waiver? Remember, Social Security is a big bureaucracy and they like forms. So the new form we're going to talk about is an SSA 632. There's a link on this slide for that particular form. Now I'm going to say something that I don't want to scare everyone with. This is a 14-page form. It's not as simple as that 4-page form for the request for reconsiderations. But the good news is that SSI beneficiaries only need to complete filling out the first 5 pages. Of course, this assumes your benefits are not terminated or suspended. If you're still receiving Social Security benefits, but you're just in an overpayment status, you need to fill out the first 5 pages of this form. Now, when you fill out the form, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, if Social Security does not grant the waiver, They'll schedule a meeting with representatives from Social Security, and you'll have another opportunity to meet with Social Security and see if you can argue your case. Regardless of whether you actually have that conference, that means it's actually held, or you decide not to have it, the next step is for you to request a reconsideration of the waiver if it's denied. And if that is unsuccessful, you can then ask for a hearing before an administrative law judge and argue again in support of why they should grant you a waiver. And when I say you, I mean the Social Security Administration. And we're going to go to the next slide. Now, this is the first page of that 14-page form. Please don't get scared. We're talking about the first 5 pages, and I'm just going to do a very basic overview. So when you see the form, you're not going to be frightened of it, and you understand what information they're asking for. Now, in the top left-hand corner, it identifies it as the form we're describing, and it's entitled Request for Waiver of Overpayment Recovery. So we know we have that right form. In the next box, it says when to complete the form. And that section there indicates the circumstances under which you have to fill out the form and what you have to show in order to prove that you shouldn't be paying the full amount and it should be waived. Now, if you look at section 1, they're identifying questions, and that is basic contact information that you'll be filling out. Much of this form is self-explanatory. I'm going to ask you to go to the next page. There'll be sections here for a representative payee. If anyone here doesn't know what that is, that's an individual that is assigned to help you manage and monitor your payments. That individual can provide that information as well. There's a section for a family member who might be assisting you with the overpayment. There are questions that will be asked about that individual. The 4th section talks about receiving the overpayment. Starting in this section from section 4, and then moving on to the next page, please. The next slide, I should say. They're going to ask a series of questions about the overpayment and its circumstances. When you received it, under what circumstances. As you can see, the form is going to ask you questions and you're going to check boxes. And there are instructions to check all that apply or only specific ones. It's not a difficult form to fill out, and it's something that you can do with the help of another individual or a trusted family member. Now, I'm going to ask you to go to the next page. That should be page 4. That's the next slide, please, Mike. And again, these are more questions about the overpayment and about your understanding of your reporting requirements. The reason they ask a lot of questions on the waiver form, unlike, say, the request for reconsideration, is because the waiver form is asking Social Security to give up their right to recover this overpayment, money you supposedly owe to them. And they want all the facts and circumstances surrounding it. So the reason they're asking these questions is to get a full idea to see if it would just be simply fair to waive or give up their right to have you pay this money back. So don't get scared by the number of pages you're filling out. They're just looking for information so they can make a reasoned decision about your case. Let's go to the next slide, Mike. Now, this is the last page. This is good. You only have to fill out pages 5 out of 14, assuming that you're still receiving Social Security benefits, that is SSI benefits. They haven't been terminated or suspended. But if you look at question 12 at the top, and there's a box there, F, 12F, it says, are you currently receiving any of the following? And the instructions are check all that apply. And one of them, the first one is, I am receiving Supplemental Security Income or SSI payments. Well, if in fact you are, and I'm presuming you are since you're filing for a waiver of your overpayment, you're going to check that box. If you can check another box, that's fine. If you happen to be receiving temporary assistance to needy families, check all that apply, check it as well. But assuming you check only even the first box, there's instructions that say, if you checked any of the boxes in this section, 12F, go to page 13. It's almost like passing go and collecting $200. So you go from page 5 to page 13. I don't have page 13 here because I didn't want to have too many forms to present to you, but page 13 is essentially the signature form. Like that last part of the request for reconsideration, you are going to sign your name as the claimant, right? The person who's challenging and wants to have this amount waived. You're going to put your contact information. And also, if you're unable to sign the document for some reason, there'll be the name and address of the person who's signing on your behalf. So once you fill out that form, that last page 13, you're done with your waiver. Page 14 is just a Privacy Act notice. You're then going to send this form, hopefully by mail, return receipt requested, to your local Social Security field office, and you're going to wait a return notice from Social Security. Now, it could be that they grant your waiver. That's good. They may grant part of it as opposed to all of it. If they deny it, as I indicated earlier, you can always end up having a personal meeting with a representative to argue your case. And if that fails, you can always go before an administrative law judge for a formal hearing. And with that, we're going to go to the next slide, please. Should I file for a reconsideration or a waiver? Now, there's no time restriction to file for a waiver, but there are time restrictions on a request for reconsideration. By filing a request for reconsideration first, which is what we ordinarily suggest, you're forcing the Social Security Administration to recalculate and review and analyze the information they put in that original overpayment notice. Depending on your circumstance, you may think you have a good chance to show that Social Security made a mistake. It may be that you have no overpayment at all, or it may be that your overpayment is much less than Social Security claims. By filing that request for reconsideration first, you're having Social Security do some work and make sure that they didn't make a mistake. And as I've indicated, Social Security does make mistakes. It's a large organization. It's a large bureaucracy. If your request for reconsideration is denied, or it's partially granted, and you still want to pursue it, then you can always have that hearing or ultimately go before an administrative law judge. And as I've indicated, the waiver can always be done. And another little trick is, say you manage to have a partially successful request for reconsideration. You do owe some money, but it's a lot less. You could always file a waiver now after that reduction, because you were successful on your appeal, and ask them to waive the remainder. And even if you've paid some of the money up front and your waiver is successful, you can still get that money back on the overpayment if your waiver is successful. So it's good to look at it as a 1-2 step process. Next slide, please. And lastly, before I leave you this afternoon, I wanted to give everyone a quick update on stimulus checks. And basically, people have been concerned that the government has been given stimulus checks, which is a good thing. But the problem is that you might be over-resourced. And as Kathleen mentioned early on, if you have too much money, such as cash or other assets per month, you might cause an overpayment because you're over-resourced. Well, if you receive one of these stimulus checks in the mail, I have good news for you. And the good news is these stimulus checks do not count towards your resource limits as an SSI recipient, so long as you spend each check within 12 months of receiving it. The 12-month period to spend down each stimulus check applies to each check separately. So we're now in our third round of stimulus checks. So as long as you receive the check and spend it within 12 months, it won't count as countable income for your resource limitations each month, and you're good to go. And lastly, I want to mention that Disability Rights will be presenting a webinar on stimulus checks and other COVID-related relief in a few weeks on May 5th. I hope you all can attend. There's some good information to be found at that webinar. And with that, my time with you is now up, and I'm going to turn you over to Susan Head. Thank you.
Thanks, Charlie. So what happens if you do nothing when you receive an overpayment letter? You can accept Social Security's decision about an overpayment and do nothing. However, if you choose to do nothing, and don't respond to the overpayment notice or request a reconsideration or a waiver, Social Security will start withholding 10% of your SSI monthly cash payment to recover the overpayment 60 days after the date on the initial overpayment notice. If Social Security deny your reconsideration appeal or waiver request and you can't afford 10% of your SSI check to be withheld, you can request Social Security reduce the amount they withhold. If you want to do this, you will need to complete and submit Social Security Form 634 to Social Security. You can find this form online or request the form from your local Social Security office. You'll need to show that you can't afford what Social Security calls ordinary and necessary living expenses. These are things like rent payments, food and transportation costs, utilities, insurance, medical expenses, etc. If the information you submit on Form 634 indicates you can't afford to have 10% of your cash benefits withheld each month without experiencing financial hardship, Social Security may limit the monthly repayment to the difference between your income and expenses and approve a reduced repayment rate. However, Social Security will not accept a repayment amount of less than $10 per month. To avoid overpayments, report your wages to Social Security within the first 6 days following the month you earn the income. Reporting your wages on time each month will help Social Security calculate your SSI monthly cash payment correctly. Social Security letters can be difficult to understand, and it's really important that you're clear why Social Security is contacting you. So if you receive a Social Security letter and you need help understanding what's in the letter, contact Social Security immediately and ask them to explain the letter to you. In addition, Social Security often sends out multiple overpayment letters. So you need to be clear when Social Security is alleging the overpayment happened and how much Social Security is claiming you were overpaid. As Charlie explained earlier, you have 60 days to submit a reconsideration appeal from the date on the initial overpayment letter. So make a note of that date so you can submit an appeal within the required time frame. The most important thing is to take action and respond to the letter. Don't put it to one side and hope the issue will go away. Also, be sure to keep good records such as pay stubs and bank statements in case Social Security requests this information. Report all changes in your living situation to Social Security that may affect your eligibility for SSI and the amount of your SSI cash payment. This includes changes in living arrangements, resources, excuse me, marital status, as well as help you may receive with living expenses from family or friends. Try to report these changes as soon as possible and no later than 10 days after the end of the month in which the change occurred. You need to report these changes because generally, the more countable income you have, the less your SSI monthly cash payment will be. Here are 2 additional steps you can take to help prevent overpayments that we'll discuss in the next few slides. One step is to set up your own My Social Security account. The other is to contact New Jersey Work Incentives Network Support to set up a free benefits planning session. As we've discussed, reporting your income to Social Security every month will help prevent an overpayment, and there are several options available to report your wages. If you have a smartphone, you can download the free SSI application from the App Store on your phone. If you're interested in reporting your wages by telephone, contact your local Social Security office to see if this option can work for you. You can also take your copies of your pay stubs to the local Social Security office or mail them to that office. If you decide to mail copies of your pay stubs to Social Security, we recommend using certified mail. Social Security's preferred method for monthly wage reporting, whenever possible, is to create a Social Security account and use the online tool available in the account to report wages. To set up an account, go to ssa.gov/myaccount. After you've created an account, you'll be able to report your wages and check on past earnings. Also, whether you've filed an appeal online, by mail, or in the local Social Security office, if you've created a My Social Security account, you can check on the status of your appeal from your account. Also, if you're the spouse, parent, or representative payee of someone receiving SSI, you may also be able to report the individual's wages online. To report wages online, you must have your own My Social Security account. Here's a free service that can help New Jersey residents aged 14 to 64 who receive SSI and Medicaid and want to work or continue working. New Jersey Work Incentives Network Support can create an individualized report about your benefits and help you understand whether you are eligible for any of the Social Security work incentives. Work incentives are Social Security tools that help create a safety net to protect SSI cash and healthcare benefits for as long as needed while a person starts or continues working. If you schedule an appointment with New Jersey WINS, you will also be able to receive follow-up assistance, including New Jersey WINS assistance, to ensure that any work incentives you're eligible to receive have been correctly applied. Here's a quick review of what we discussed today, which was a lot of information. So if you have any questions in what I see is just the remaining 8 minutes, now is your opportunity to do so. So I'm going to hand over to Mike. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thanks, Susan. So we had a bunch of questions in the chat, and I know that our speakers have been moving through them, and I will ask the three of you, are there questions that you've seen that you would like to tackle first?
I think there was one question, Mike. I don't know who the questioner was, but I think it related to maybe the third part of it's not fair to pay the money back on a waiver.
Yes, that was Mike O'Brien.
Okay, so Mike O'Brien. Mike, it's a good question. And, you know, like a lot of things with Social Security law, it's not always entirely clear. I mean, they give you guidance. But if you have those three reasons, it's sort of a mix and match. It's reason number one, which is always being without fault, you know, and number two, which is you won't be able to pay your basic necessary bills to live. Or it could be number one, I'm without fault in causing the overpayment. And it's the third prong, which I think you're asking about, that third sort of like, you know, issue, which is it's unfair. And what Social Security rules say is they talk about it's against equity and good conscience to make the SSI recipient pay that money back. And Social Security sometimes takes a very narrow view of that they had to do something that made you give up a right, or they confused you, or you relied on their advice. But there's some cases that say, no, it should have a broader view. You know, being unfair means it's being inequitable, and we're talking about equity, and equity is fairness, Mike. So what happens is if you could show in a circumstance that you're without fault in causing an overpayment, right? It's not your problem, you didn't cause it, and you owe a ton of money, maybe $25,000, and there's no way you're going to be able to pay that back and still be able to live your life. That would be an argument that it's simply not fair. And there's cases that have circumstances like that. It depends on which field office you go to. It depends on which administrative law judge you may end up in front of. But to answer your question simply, unfair means, according to the Social Security Act, against equity and good conscience to make the recipient pay the money back. It's always fact sensitive, so it would depend on the facts of your case. Presumably, if it's a large overpayment and you really are without fault in causing it, you'd have a strong argument to make in a waiver application. It's just not right to make me pay this money back. I'll be made destitute. I won't be able to live my life. So I hope that's a reasonable answer, because I can't give you a hard and fast rule. So thanks for the question, though.
I wanted to jump in for a minute too and just say that every single question is going to be addressed, even if we don't have time to address it today. But I see that Barbara Coppins had said Josephine had a question. Did you want to come on video and ask the question?
Josephine, you can turn your microphone on, or Barbara, if you're with Josephine. There it is. I see Barbara.
Yeah. All right, Josie, shoot, go for it.
Hi, Kathy. This is Josephine. I'm calling to speak to you about. It's about the Social Security. I have Social Security, and when I get retirement Social Security now, because I have retired. I used to work at CBS. I got retired. I worked there for 15 years, and I know a good way you can try to help these people out so they do not lose their Social Security. It's the best way is to have them put money into ARP. What is it called, Barbara?
New Jersey Able.
New Jersey Able, to help them out so they can't lose their Social Security. So that way they have it when they need it for that money for emergency. They can always draw that money out as emergency if they need it. And plus that way if they have to pay bills and stuff, they have enough money to pay the bills and food and stuff, whatever they need, and clothes. That's what I have to speak about, Kathy, for right now for you.
Thank you so much, Josephine, for your comment. And actually, we are going to have a separate webinar on ABLE accounts. And I saw that there was a comment about ABLE accounts, and it's a really important resource that we're going to be talking about at a later time. So thank you so much again for joining as well. I also saw there was a question that said something like, how would, okay, this is from Amber. How would they know if someone gave you a cash or wrote you a personal check? And I mean, obviously, you know, we wouldn't be able to advise you on how you would be able to avoid detection. You know, our advice would always have to be that you have to be honest about the resources that you're receiving. But I guess what I would say is if they find out, then you might end up in a situation of having an overpayment. And so it's just best to avoid those kind of situations, whether it's through, you know, an ABLE account or some other means. And we're not going to go into that particularly today, but that will be the subject of a future webinar. All right, and I think we're wrapping up towards the end, but I think we have time for one more. So there was a question that Amy Welsh had, and she said, is it true that SSA can only go back 2 years when reviewing income for overpayments? And so what I'll say is, just like with any of these questions, even if it's a general question, it is a really complex issue and there are always exceptions. Generally, that is true. But if there was like a fraud, for instance, they would be able to go back more than that. But certainly, I'd like to follow up with anybody who has, you know, whether it's a general question or a specific question. We are here to help at Disability Rights New Jersey. We have our Director of Legal Advocacy who had put that in the comments as well. Even if it's not an overpayment issue, we are here to help the disability community with legal issues.
And as we come to the top of the hour, everybody, as Kathleen said, we will follow up. The panel members will follow up with individuals about your questions. And of course, you can always reach out to us at the information listed on the slide here, whether that is through our 800 number if you're in New Jersey, which is 800-922-7233, or you can email us at advocate@drnj.org. So either of those ways will get to us, and someone will be able to get back to you and help you out with your situation. Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead,
briefly, I did have, because there were a lot of specific questions in the chat, I did provide my email address. So I know that some people are going to be following up with some specific situations that they had, but you can also send the email to the email address that was just provided as well.
Wonderful. Excellent. Excellent. Well, everyone, thank you for joining us for our webinar today. I hope you found this helpful and beneficial. We look forward to connecting with you again at one of our future events. And as I mentioned in the beginning, we will follow up with you sometime in the next day or two with the link to the recording that lives online so you could review this information as well. Again, thank you and have a great rest of the day.